History as it happens, February 8th, 2024. Auschwitz through Nazi eyes.
Im Sommer 1941 wurde ich persönlichen Befehlsempfang zum Reichsführer SS Himmler nach Berlin befohlen.
That is the voice of Rudolph Hoess, the commandant at the Auschwitz death camp, testifying at the Nuremberg trials before being transported to Poland, where he was executed at the same camp where he had implemented Hitler's final solution. His domestic life is dramatized in the Oscar-nominated film The Zone of Interest, a provocative rendering of the Nazis' crimes that keeps the cameras off their victims. That's next as we report History as it Happens, a podcast from the Washington Times. I'm Martin DeCaro.
Im Osten steht unser Morgen. Herzlichen Dank für eure nationalsozialistische Gastfreundschaft. Heil Hitler.
These were not ordinary people. These were not ordinary desktop perpetrators. These were people who were extremely violent, they were extremely anti-Semitic, and they had an extremely strong anti-Semitic worldview. So the problem with the zone of interest is that it starts in Auschwitz. It doesn't tell us the prehistory of Hoess. It doesn't give us any insight into how Hoess became a Nazi. And I was thinking, when I walked home from the movie theater, I was thinking of an older feature film about Rudolph Hoess, which was shot in West Germany in the 1970s. It came out in 1977. It's a film called Death is My Trade.
The family lives an idyllic life. They have a nice home with servants in the countryside, a spacious garden and swimming pool. The man of the house, a devoted political soldier, goes on leisurely horse rides with his son after work. The mother raises her kids to love their country, to idolize their leader. Except this family, Rudolph and Hedwig Hoess and their 5 kids, lives next door to Auschwitz, the death camp where 1 million Jews were murdered by the Nazis. Rudolph was the commandant there, a fanatically loyal SS officer dedicated to implementing the final solution. And they are the subject of Jonathan Glazer's powerful Oscar-nominated film, The Zone of Interest.
Das hier ist die Mauer vom Lager. Ja, das ist die Lagermauer.
In this scene, Hedwig is showing her mother around the garden, the death camp looming on the other side of the wall. A few herbs, rosemary, beetroot, this is fennel, sunflowers. And that's the camp wall, her mother asks. Yes, that's the camp wall. We planted more vines at the back to grow and cover it, Hedwig continues, more consumed by her plants than the manufacture of mass death next door. Maybe Esther Silberman is over there, says the mother. Which one was she, asks Hedwig. The one I used to clean for, responds Mom. Such scenes make up most of this film. Conversations about mundane things, gardens, clothes, whatever, with hints at what's happening around them. The soundtrack of The Zone of Interest is the distant, churning rumble of the railroad and crematoria, the instruments of genocide, punctuated by screams and gunshots, all while getting their kids out the door in the morning after another hearty breakfast. 80 years after these events, Hitler, his henchmen, the Third Reich, are still with us, in books, newspapers, movies, plays. And as you know from listening to recent episodes here, I've been trying to convince people to stop comparing the crisis of American democracy today to what happened in Germany back then. But we still must study and reflect upon what happened in Germany. We can do that by reading history books or seeing a thought-provoking film. In The Zone of Interest, the Jews are mostly invisible. They are servants, slaves really, in the Hoess home. The focus is on the perpetrator, Rudolph Hoess, who is depicted for the most part as a cold bureaucrat without ideological passion, a depiction that is misleading even if it makes for a good movie. Christian Goeschel is a historian at the University of Manchester. He is an expert on Nazi Germany, recommended by none other than Sir Ian Kershaw. Goeschel is the author of, most recently, Mussolini and Hitler, The Forging of the Fascist Alliance. Christian Goeschel, welcome.
It's great to be on the show, Martin.
Anyone Ian Kershaw recommends has to be good. We'll start with that. So I guess, we can't get rid of Adolf Hitler the Third Reich and the Holocaust, I think some people wonder, why do we have to keep talking about all this? I mean, I've been talking a lot about this subject matter on my podcast recently because the comparisons to fascism and Nazism won't go away.
People have been talking about Nazism and fascism ever since the 1920s, and we will always keep talking about Hitler regardless of the current political context. There are some alarming developments in the Western world, in many countries where you see the rise of far-right populist regimes, of far-right populist politicians. History doesn't repeat itself. We cannot learn direct lessons from the history of National Socialism for today, but the history of National Socialism, the history we are talking about today on the podcast, Martin, that sharpens our mind, that explains to us how easily liberal democracy can give way to dictatorship. But we will absolutely talk about Nazism for decades, for centuries to come, because these 12 years, these fateful 12 years in the history of Germany had such a dire impact, not only on the people of Germany, not only on the Jews, but on the world at large. If you think about a regime started by Hitler, who was a nobody after the First World War, how he could build his party, the National Socialist Party, how he could turn it into a violent mass movement that created a racist dictatorship in Germany, that plunged the world into the war, and that murdered 6 million Jews of Europe. This is a story that will never go away, regardless of contemporary politics.
So enduring consequences, no question. And the number of books I have on my shelves at home speaks to the importance of reading and studying this. Volker Ulrich, he just wrote in the last several years, a 2-volume biography of Hitler, and he addresses this in the introduction to one of those volumes. Why can't we get rid of this guy? Well, you just explained why we can't. It's not to make cheap comparisons today, but we have to understand our history. We have to study this stuff because, as many have pointed out, and I'm sure you agree with this, understanding the Third Reich helps us understand how ordinary people, how we all have, even if it's to a tiny degree, the potential to hate the other and see the other as less than human, less worthy of human life.
What we see in the history of the Third Reich is how the people of Germany, a highly advanced country in the interwar period, how many people in Germany became complicit in one way or another in everyday racism, how so many Germans became complicit or became actively involved in discriminating against racial minorities, above all the Jews, in how ordinary people could become involved in genocidal mass murder. That is also a story that will never go away. To me, as a historian who has been dealing with the history of Nazism for more than 20 years now, the history of Nazi Germany is very much part of contemporary history to me, perhaps because of my profession, because of my job of teaching about it, researching about it. It feels much closer than, say, the 1960s or 1970s. Yeah. So, and of course, there are more books written on the Third Reich than on almost any other period in history. There are more films produced on the Third Reich and the Holocaust, more so than on any other period in history, perhaps. So the Third Reich is very much part of our everyday culture today. But what is important when we deal with the Third Reich is that we get it right, that we get the facts right, that we get our interpretations right, because we have a moral obligation to the victims of National Socialism to be absolutely accurate and precise.
Great segue into my next question. Interpretations of the Third Reich and the Holocaust, whether it's in novels, film, history books, which are supposed to be accurate. What did you think of the movie, The Zone of Interest?
I watched The Zone of Interest a few days ago at a movie theater here in Manchester, England. It's an art house movie theater, but nevertheless, when I normally go there, people are quite loud. They eat crisps or chips, as you say in the United States. They would eat popcorn. Some people would chat while the film is being screened. This time, you could have heard a pin drop. The audience was absolutely captivated by the film. I thought from an artistic, aesthetic point of view, it was a really great film, distinguished above all by the excellent actors. Sandra Hüller, above all, who's been nominated for an Academy Award, and also Christian Friedel, who plays the main character, Rudolph Hoess, the commandant of the Auschwitz concentration and death camp. It is an absolutely gripping film, but to be honest, when I left the movie theater, I was in a split mind. It's extremely well edited. Everything is extremely well photographed. The costumes are great. But then, as a historian who's been working on the history of Nazism and the Holocaust for so many years, I was quite dissatisfied, because what the film does is to give the view of the commandant of Auschwitz and of his family leading a happy domestic life, but there is almost no reference, there is no explanation whatsoever why people like Rudolph Hoess became mass murderers, why an ordinary person like Rudolph Hoess became the commandant of Auschwitz, why he became one of the chief mass murderers of the Nazi regime. Hoess himself is responsible for the murder of more than 1 million Jews at the Auschwitz camp. And the zone of interest doesn't tell us anything at all about why Hoess became a mass murderer. The film doesn't give us any insight into Hoess's ideology. What the film does is that it peddles a stereotypical interpretation of National Socialism, of Nazi perpetrators. The film peddles a facile interpretation of Nazi perpetrators, which was summarized by the German Jewish philosopher Hannah Arendt when she reported for the New Yorker magazine from the Eichmann trial in Jerusalem in the 1960s. She coined the phrase, the banality of evil. I do not think this phrase, the banality of evil, does justice to the behavior of people like Rudolf Hoess, the commandant of Auschwitz.
Or Adolf Eichmann either.
Yes, these were not ordinary people. These were not ordinary desktop perpetrators. These were people who were extremely violent. They were extremely anti-Semitic, and they had an extremely strong anti-Semitic worldview. So the problem with the zone of interest is that it starts in Auschwitz. It doesn't tell us the prehistory of Hoess. It doesn't give us any insight into how Hoess became a Nazi. And I was thinking, when I walked home from the movie theater, I was thinking of an older feature film about Rudolf Hoess, which was shot in West Germany in the 1970s. It came out in 1977. It's a film called Death is My Trade, which is a West German film about Rudolf Hoess, which starts with Rudolf Hoess's post-World War I career in one of the far-right, racist, anti-Semitic Freikorps paramilitary organizations. It shows how Hoess served time in jail for committing a political murder in the 1920s. It shows how Hoess became an SS officer, how he rose through the ranks. So the zone of interest doesn't give us any background. To be fair, the zone of interest is a feature film. It's not a documentary, but the other people in the audience in Manchester in this movie theater, I wondered how much they actually understood what was driving Hoess.
I agree with you. I am of two minds as well about the movie. As art, it was very effective. I thought it was very powerful. I've been thinking of the movie since I saw it, and I want to see it again, because anytime you watch a movie the first time through, you miss things. You know, you're waiting as you watch the movie. Are they going to go and show people dying in the gas chambers? Sorry for a spoiler alert here. That never happens. I mean, the camera basically stays inside the Hoess household, and they're living their dream. While you hear in the background, it's audible at all times, that churning, the manufacture of mass death and genocide in the background. But as you said, not to repeat your point, if someone walked into that theater knowing very little about the subject matter, and there are probably some people who haven't read much about this, they may come away that Hoess was just a pencil-pushing bureaucrat, not a fanatical Nazi. He was just a cog in this machine doing his duty rather than somebody who wanted to be there and thought he was fulfilling a historic mission to rid the world of Jews.
Hoess was absolutely committed to the ideals of National Socialism. He was a diehard anti-Semite. He wasn't simply obeying orders. He was actively creating space for the mass murder of Jews at the Auschwitz camp. He was overseeing the slave labor of Jewish prisoners and of other prisoners at Auschwitz. So many of them were literally worked to death. So Hoess wasn't a pen-pushing bureaucrat. He was a diehard Nazi. Hoess saw himself not as a bureaucrat. He saw himself as a political soldier. The idea of a political soldier, a hyper-masculine idea of a committed Nazi, was prominent among the SS. And Hoess really saw himself as a pater familias who would look after his wife, who would look after his children, but he also saw it as his job to make sure that he would kill, he would murder as many Jews as possible. And what the Zone of Interest does extremely effectively is that it portrays the domestic life of Hoess and his family. You do not see how Jews are being murdered. You hear very ominous, threatening sounds. You hear people screaming. You hear gunshots. You hear SS guards yelling.
You hear the railroad.
Hear dogs barking. But you don't really see at all what is happening at the camp. You have at the back of the screen, you sometimes see trains coming in, trains carrying new prisoners, carrying people who will soon be murdered, who will soon be sent to the gas chambers. But you don't actually see any atrocities in the film. So the film's depiction of Hoess's domestic life is extremely accurate. It sounds perverse to us, but they thought this is the life they have earned. There is a lot of lower middle class aspiration prominent, in the dialogues, that they are so happy to have a beautiful garden, that they have a swimming pool. Hoess has his horse. They are benefiting from prisoners, who are working as their domestic servants. There is a prisoner, for example, who cleans Hoess's riding boots at the beginning of the film.
That's right. And he also had a woman, and I did not know this, a prisoner from the camp. I guess you would call her a sex slave, who is later sent to her death.
And he tried to cover up this affair. What the film also shows is the extreme corruption of Hoess and other SS officers. And this was also true, that Hoess was benefiting from, the property of Jews who had been sent into the gas chambers. At the beginning of the film, we see Mrs. Hoess putting on a new mink coat, not a new mink coat, it's a mink coat that has been taken away from prisoners who have been sent into their death. There is a particularly macabre, appalling, ghastly scene where Mrs. Hoess reaches into the pocket of that mink coat and she finds a lipstick and she tries it on.
Yes. And that's what makes it horrifying, that these people could just be so closed off to the humanity of the other. But yes, the director chose to do it that way, and not in a different way that would have clued us in more to what Hoess was really like. And that's the director's choice. I defer to the creative person here. They're doing the movie, but that doesn't mean we can't have a bone to pick with it. The movie is based on a novel, same title, The Zone of Interest, that came out, 10 years or so ago by Martin Amis. Have you ever read that?
I haven't read this particular novel by Martin Amis, and this is a fair point you are making here, that the film doesn't purport to be a documentary. The film is the adaptation of Martin Amis's novel, The Zone of Interest. But I haven't read the novel myself.
Yeah, it's much different. It's sarcastic. It uses humor to try to convey the horror of Auschwitz, and they use different characters. They're totally fictional characters, even though it's like the movie. The movie is a dramatization, maybe accurate in the way it shows Hoess moving around his property. But the book is fictional characters. The Commandant is named Paul Doll, D-O-L-L. I have not read the book, but I've read about the book to prepare for this episode. And there's a love story involved. It's a much different take. But this is an issue I want to discuss with you. What is the right or wrong way to convey the Holocaust? For a long time, it wasn't even a subject of historical study, let alone artistic expression. Do you have any views on right and wrong ways to reflect on this?
There have been many, many depictions of the Holocaust, but interest in the Holocaust really only started at a large level in the 1970s. One of the milestones was the CBS miniseries starring Meryl Streep and others. This series was called Holocaust. And it's only been in the wake of this CBS miniseries that people have been talking about the Holocaust instead of, say, the Nazi term, the final solution of the Jewish question, which was the Nazi euphemism for their mass murder of the Jews. There has been a lot of debate about how to depict the Holocaust, how to depict mass murder. The main thing, and this is where the Zone of Interest gets it right. The main thing is that one mustn't trivialize the suffering. The Zone of Interest doesn't trivialize the suffering, but it still offers an incomplete picture. There have been films. Another milestone that comes to my mind is Steven Spielberg's Schindler's List, which is a film from the early 1990s, which was a massive success across the world. And this was a film that really created a lot of interest in the Holocaust. I remember I was at school in West Germany in the 1990s when Schindler's List came out, and that was a film that really made me interested in trying to find out more about how Germans could organize the Holocaust, how this could have happened. So my hope is that people who watch the Zone of Interest will not stop thinking about the Holocaust, but rather that the Zone of Interest will make people engaged with the history of the Holocaust.
I've read a good deal about this, but I found myself thinking about, what do I know about Rudolph Hoess? Why is it not coming to me? So I wound up buying not the novel I mentioned by Martin Amis. I picked up Hoess's autobiography, which has a lot of historic value and absolutely no literary value. The introduction is done by Primo Levi, and the introduction is wonderful, and he tells you all the areas where Hoess is lying. He wrote the book when he had already been convicted and was awaiting the hangman. As you said at the top of our conversation, he was a very violent guy who had a sordid past. There's no remorse expressed at all in this autobiography.
I read the autobiography several times, and if you read this autobiography, it gives you a chill down your spine. Hoess wrote this autobiography while he was awaiting execution in Poland, and he was subsequently executed outside the gates of the Auschwitz camp after the Second World War. Hoess's autobiography is extremely self-pitying, but what I find truly remarkable about Hoess's autobiography is that he admits to having killed so many Jews. He doesn't deny responsibility, which is what the other surviving Nazi leaders did after the Second World War. Most Nazi leaders said, we didn't know about the gassing of the Jews. We didn't know about the mass murder of the Jews. We didn't know about the Holocaust. Hoess admitted, we did it. Hoess also appeared in the Nuremberg trials in April 1946. He was a witness for the prosecution, and he shocked world audiences who were following the Nuremberg trials on radio through newspapers by admitting that at Auschwitz, millions of Jews had been gassed. He was one of the few Nazis who openly admitted it. Hoess showed no empathy whatsoever. He had no moral qualms. He thought he had done the right thing. He had thought that according to his moral compass, to his Nazi moral compass, it had been his moral duty to murder more than 1 million Jews. So it is an absolutely terrible book. It has no literary value whatsoever, but it gives you some insight into the mindset of one of the leading Nazi mass murderers.
Fanatic was not an insult. That was a compliment to them.
And in this autobiography, he sets out his idea of being a political soldier. The autobiography is embellished. He lies about his alleged war service in World War I, for example. That he really talks about his moral compass. He shows off about being a caring family father, but he cannot show, and he refuses to show, any empathy for the millions of people he killed. He still says openly in his autobiography that he's a convinced Nazi, he's a convinced anti-Semite.
The opening chapters talking about how he learned as a child the importance of devotion to duty and respect for authority. This guy, a mass murderer. So about Schindler's List, that was also criticized, though, for showing the non-Jewish savior, that it sought to find a redemption story in all of that misery and genocide. I think it's a no-win situation. If all you do is show death and misery, it becomes genocide porn. But as you know, as a scholar of this subject, that was one of the criticisms of historicizing the Holocaust, treating it as a historical subject, and also artistic expression about it, that this was so awful, so unique.
The question you're asking can be summarized in a few words. There was a debate about probing the limits of representation. How can one accurately represent the Holocaust as a historian, as a political scientist, as a literary scholar, or as an artist? We will never find a satisfactory answer. It's a no-win situation, but we have to write about the Holocaust. The filmmakers have to continue making films about the Holocaust, because if we stop talking about the Holocaust, if we stop reading about it, if we stop writing about it, there is the palpable danger that we might forget about it. So we absolutely have to continue engaging in thinking, writing, making films about the Holocaust.
In 1967, there was a German book published, The Inability to Mourn, which started getting Germany going in the right direction here, because today many people would look at Germany as a model of facing up to the bad parts of its history. But it really took, at least this is Ian Kershaw's interpretation, until the 1980s, 40 years after the end of World War II, for the Holocaust to assume a central role in public debate, historical inquiry. How did that happen?
Germany was divided at the end of the Second World War into two countries, the Western zone of occupation controlled by the Americans, the British and the French, and the Eastern zone controlled by the Soviets. In both German states, memories of the Holocaust didn't play a big role in official state commemorations of the Second World War. In East Germany, the communist regime said the main victims of National Socialism were not the Jews. The main victims of National Socialism were the working class. There was an extremely simplified version of what had happened during the Second World War. In West Germany, on the other hand, there was a huge emphasis on German victimhood. People talked about the bombing of German cities by the British, by the Americans. They talked about the expulsion of millions of Germans from territories that became Poland or Czechoslovakia after the Second World War. There was a lot of emphasis on German victimhood. There was simply no space for talking about the suffering of the Jews. The Jews had been a small minority in Germany when the Nazis had come to power in 1933, and for many Germans, after the war in particular, the fate of the Jews played a very small role. The book you mentioned by Margarete and Alexander Mitscherlich, these were two psychoanalysts working in West Germany who had done interviews with patients. They wrote this famous book, The Inability to Mourn, in 1967, and the inability to mourn became shorthand for how most West Germans had swept memories of the Holocaust under the carpet, that most people in West Germany wanted to get on with their lives. They wanted to rebuild German cities. They wanted to rebuild the German economy, which was booming in the post-war period. But there were some moments in the 1950s and 1960s when the Holocaust became the matter of public debate. In 1958, in the southwestern German city of Ulm, leading SS Einsatzgruppen officers, death squad officers, were put on trial and sentenced for the war crimes they had committed in the Soviet Union following Germany's invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941. This included the killing of Jews. And then in the early 1960s, a massive trial started in Frankfurt, which was called the Auschwitz trials, where the German Jewish prosecutor Fritz Bauer, through his indefatigable efforts, had made sure that people who had worked at the Auschwitz camp as guards, as SS guards, that they were put on trial. And this trial, I remember talking to my father about it. He was at high school when this trial happened. The history teacher took them to these trials. So my father remembers you could actually see these Nazi perpetrators who looked totally ordinary, and they had committed the most bestial atrocities. They had murdered tens of thousands of people, some of them individually. So there were some small steps towards talking about the Holocaust in the West German public. But Ian Kershaw is right that it was not until the 1980s that the Holocaust became the central focal point of debates in West Germany and elsewhere about the Third Reich.
Because how could something like that be forgotten? Well, that's how it happens. Within a generation, things can fade into the mists of history if you don't educate the next upcoming generation. And time has a way of making even something like that recede into the back of our minds. The West German economic miracle, people wanted to get on with the good times and not talk about this horrible chapter in our past, especially if it meant having to face up to our own involvement in it. You mentioned the movie Holocaust. That was in 1978, had an enormous audience in West Germany. Claude Lanzmann had a documentary in 1985, Shoah. But before these movies and documentaries came out during this period, were there many novels or movies or radio shows about the Holocaust anywhere, let alone Germany?
There were lots and lots of films, radio programs, lots of books were being published on aspects of National Socialism. The famous American historian Raoul Hilberg was one of the first serious scholars to write about the Holocaust in the late 1960s, but his work was initially widely disregarded. So it took a really long time for historians, for the wider public, to realize the monstrosity of the Holocaust. But it is not true to say, well, it was only in the 1980s that people started talking about it. People had been talking about the Holocaust. Think of the Jerusalem trial of Adolf Eichmann, who had been one of the chief architects of the Holocaust. He had been abducted in Argentina, where he had fled after the war, like many German war criminals, by Mossad agents, and then he was flown to Israel, where he was put on trial, and then he was sentenced to death as the only man who's ever been sentenced to death by an Israeli court. So there were some moments, but the Holocaust really only emerged as the focal point, as the focus of interest in the 1980s, because historical research, historical commemorations, they take a long time. They are processes. They are processes which work in a multi-directional way. It is simply not possible for a government in a liberal democracy like West Germany or the United States to order how people should think about their history. It's a long and drawn-out process. And I would also like to mention local history initiatives in West Germany. So as part of the student movement, there was a huge interest in local history. And it was in the 70s and 80s that history workshops were established across West Germany, where people tried to find out what actually happened to the Jews of our village, what happened to the Jews of our neighborhood. So these initiatives were also extremely important in creating awareness of the Holocaust in West German culture in the 1980s.
And the key words here are central role in public debate, historical inquiry. It wasn't that there were no books or no conversations, but when it assumed a central role to the point where we now have an enormous reservoir of scholarship over the past several decades. You can walk into any library and find great books about this subject. I'm holding one of them in my hands right now by Ian Kershaw. The title is Hitler, the Germans, and the Final Solution, and there's an important chapter here about this subject, the controversy over historicizing the Holocaust. What can you tell us about that?
So there was a huge debate in the 1980s started by right-wing German historians, by extremely conservative German historians, who said that National Socialism had been a reaction to Stalinism. These historians tried to deny that Auschwitz, that the Nazi Holocaust of the Jews was unique. And there was a very, very strong reaction, quite rightly so, by historians who insisted on the uniqueness of the Holocaust, who insisted that the Holocaust was a German project started by Germans, and that there was no way that one could make any excuses for the Holocaust. That was the first part of the so-called Historikerstreit, the historians' dispute, that dominated newspaper headlines in West Germany in the late 1980s, a few years before German reunification. Then, related to this debate, was the debate about whether it was possible to historicize National Socialism and the Holocaust. Some German historians had insisted one had to study the Holocaust, one had to study the Third Reich in the same way, with the same scholarly distance as one would study earlier or other historical periods, such as the Middle Ages. Many historians were furious about this plea for historicization because they said it is obscene. You cannot historicize such a monstrous, genocidal, unique event. So there have always been debates about how historians should represent the Holocaust, how they should talk about the Holocaust. And what all these debates, what all of these inconclusive debates have shown is, at least for me, is that we owe it to the victims of the Holocaust that we are as accurate as possible. We have to beware of the moral high ground when we work about the Holocaust, when we write or talk about the Holocaust. I do not know how I would have behaved. I'm very honest and open about this. I have no idea. I wished I had been totally against the Nazis, but so many people who were complicit in the Holocaust, they were not diehard Nazi anti-Semitic ideologues. They were not Nazi fanatics, unlike Rudolph Hoess, the main character in The Zone of Interest. Many Germans were indifferent towards the fate of the Jews. As one famous historian once said, it's actually Ian Kershaw, the road to Auschwitz was paved with indifference. There was so much indifference towards the suffering of the Jews, towards the fate of the Jews in the 1930s and 40s, and it was this indifference that made the Holocaust possible.
And as you say, there was a lot of focus as well on German feelings of victimhood because there was widespread bombing of Germany and expulsion of German people from eastern lands where they had settled after the Wehrmacht and the SS went east. Not to do an entire recap of World War II here, but thank you, Christian, for summing up that debate, the dimensions of the debate as to how to historicize the Holocaust. Because from our perspective today, most people are saying, what? There was a time where people thought we shouldn't write history about this? Well, of course we have to. Yet at the same time, we can't dismiss the concerns out of hand because they are legitimate.
I would like to add one more thing. So
Sure.
there was a lot of indifference of the German people towards the Jews, but there were also some Nazi fanatics. There were some people like Rudolph Hoess. There were thousands of people like Hoess, maybe not as high-ranking as Rudolph Hoess, who really thought it their moral duty to deal with the Jewish problem, what they saw as the Jewish problem. So there wasn't only indifference, there wasn't only ordinary life, like the life of the Hoess family outside the perimeter fence of the Auschwitz death and concentration camp. There were also people who were absolutely driven by Nazi ideology, and Rudolph Hoess was one of them.
And we'll go full circle here. We'll bring it back to the movie, The Zone of Interest. What if they had just done one scene where you hear Hoess talking like a Nazi fanatic? He doesn't need to necessarily be on a podium or a dais screaming like Hitler, right? But why would they have? No one in that household would have questioned what they were doing to begin with.
I mean, to be fair, there are some scenes when Hoess is dictating orders into the telephone.
That's right.
And in the language he speaks is a very basic but also bureaucratically cold language. When he gives orders to speed up the construction of a crematorium at Auschwitz where the bodies of murdered Jews could be burned more efficiently. So you have him talking, and he wouldn't have given big ideological speeches like Hitler or the Reich leader of the SS Himmler. He was a person tasked with implementing the Holocaust. There are some inaccuracies in the film when Hoess and his wife are talking about, Hitler. So there is no evidence that Hitler personally ordered the creation of gas chambers at Auschwitz. It is clear that such a monstrous project wouldn't have gone ahead without Hitler's explicit or tacit approval, but the governing mechanisms of the Third Reich were organized in a way that people were working towards the Führer. They were working towards Hitler. Hitler didn't have to give express orders. Hitler never ever visited a concentration, let alone a death camp. During the 12 years of the Third Reich, he left the implementation of detail up to others, the Reich leader of the SS, Himmler, and then ultimately Himmler tasked Hoess, the commandant of the Auschwitz camp, with the implementation of the Holocaust in that particular camp.
You and Kershaw, I believe, are on the same page here. Something of such magnitude as the final solution was ordered or was the idea of the highest ranks, Hitler himself, of the Nazi leadership. But how to implement it, because we all know that the Holocaust started with the Holocaust by bullets, but a more efficient way had to be developed to accelerate the program and to go easier on the men who were doing the shooting. There was nothing about going easier on the victims. That term, working towards the Führer, I was first introduced to that by reading Ian Kershaw's scholarship. Rivers of ink have been spilt on this subject, Christian, about, was there a single order anywhere or a single meeting where, Hitler is there with Himmler and some others and say, okay, now's the time to start the final solution. Or you could look at it more of as an evolution of an exterminationist program, a series of decisions made over the course of many years.
It was an evolution of an exterminatory policy, and the evolution of the exterminatory policy, which was always on the Nazis' minds, to be prepared to murder the Jews. But the Nazis, when they came to power, they didn't know how to make Germany free of the Jews, as they put it, to rid Germany of the Jews, as the Nazis put it in their racist language. So the evolution of the Holocaust can only be understood as a process, and it was a process that was closely related to the fortunes of the war, of the Second World War. It's not a coincidence that the death camps, Majdanek, Sobibor, Treblinka, and also Auschwitz, that they were not on the soil of the German Reich, that they were in Poland, that they were in Eastern Europe. So there is this conversation between Hoess and his wife when they talk about the East. We are colonizing the East. That was also part of a broader Nazi plan to settle Germans, to settle German Aryans in Eastern Europe. And one of the conditions of settling Germans there was, of course, the extermination of Jewish people who were living in these areas.
Lebensraum was the term, living space.
Living space was one of the key Nazi projects, but living space could only function based on the premise of mass murder. So there was Lebensraum, but there was also Massenmord, although the Nazis would have never used the latter term. They preferred euphemisms such as the final solution of the Jewish question.
Or the zone of interest, which was a euphemism for the death camp at Auschwitz. I mean, the zone of interest is as bland as you can get. It doesn't tell you anything about what's going on there.
What you hear in these monologues when Hoess in this film is talking into his phone, when he's dictating orders, he talks about units. He talks about human beings as units. He completely dehumanizes Jews. So he has absolutely no empathy for the people whom he is sending into the gas chambers.
And one more point about the evolution of the exterminationist program. For a while, the Nazis were talking about, as they continued to expand to the east and conquer more areas where millions of Jews lived, maybe shipping them all to Madagascar, or just starving, 10 to 20 to 30 million people, all Slavic people, all Untermensch, by pushing them into Siberia.
There were several interrelated Nazi plans for genocide. The so-called Madagascar plan had to be shelved due to the declining fortunes in the war. That was a plan to send Europe's Jews to Madagascar. On the journey, thousands, if not more, would have died in primitive conditions on the ships that would have taken them there. And of course, on Madagascar itself, it would have been almost impossible for so many people to survive. So that plan already included mass violence and mass murder. This plan had to be shelved. There were German intellectuals, extremely intelligent people with PhDs, who tried to organize the so-called General Plan Ost, the General Plan East, which calculated that millions and millions of Jews and Slavic people would be starved to death. So Germanic people, so that the German people would have enough food to survive. The important point here is that we are not talking about abstract processes. We are not talking about abstract plans. We are not talking about structures. We have to bring it back to the perpetrators. We have to bring it back to the people who organized, often out of their own will, almost always out of their own will, for career aspirations, out of ideological commitment or combination of both, these murderous plans. And what we cannot do with impunity is to talk about the Holocaust without thinking about the 6 million Jews who were murdered. In the zone of interest, we see some prisoners working in the Hoess household. And the film ends with a cold remark by Mrs. Hoess when she is angry about her mother's departure. And then she says to one of the prisoners who works as a servant in the Hoess household, well, I could send you to death if I simply called my husband. So there is a small perspective of the prisoners, but I would have wished that the film would have given more space to the perspective of the Jewish prisoners.
Doesn't this get depressing, reading about and studying this? I mean, I talk about it in my podcast here and there, but this is your life, your professional life anyway.
It's a depressing subject, but it's a subject that we have to approach if we want to make full sense of the Third Reich. There is no way that we can tell ever a positive story about the Third Reich, because at the center of the Third Reich was the realization of the genocidal project of the Holocaust. There is no way around it. And trying to understand how human beings were able to get engaged, to get involved, to organize the Holocaust, that'll be a question that'll keep historians busy for the next few generations.
Yes, the Third Reich was a project based on the wholesale slaughter of many tens of millions of people to make room for the so-called master race. And so that is why I often bristle about Nazi comparisons today. There are no Nazis seeking office in the United States of America.
Comparisons to the Nazis have been widespread also in Europe since the end of the Second World War. What is to be gained if we make these Nazi comparisons? I wonder. It's a difficult subject, and we have to call out racism when we see it. Of course, we have to call out genocide when we see it today. But saying about a politician whom one doesn't like, oh, this is a Nazi, in most cases, not in all cases perhaps, it is absolutely unuseful and unhelpful. But I liked the way, I'm jumping in here, I liked the point about the Nazi project. National Socialism was not a regime that was imposed upon the German people. There was a lot of terror, there was a lot of repression, undoubtedly. But without some form of approval, the Nazi regime would not have existed.
Popular dictatorship.
So the Nazi regime was a dictatorship that mobilized millions of people in one way or another. Millions of Germans were either members of the Nazi party or one of its subsidiary organizations, such as the Nazi Students' League, the Hitler Youth, the League of German Girls. So Nazism was really a project that mobilized the German people.
Popular dictatorship is the term that I use, and that's another Kershaw. As you could tell, Ian Kershaw and Richard Evans have greatly influenced my thinking on this. So we thank Christian Goeschel for joining us from the University of Manchester to discuss the film The Zone of Interest and the study of the Holocaust. The movie is up for several Academy Awards, including Best Picture in March. On the next episode of History as It Happens, we're going to take another look at all the chaos in the world today, the several wars, if you want to call them that are underway, small wars, in the Middle East. Trita Parsi returns to the podcast as we report History as It Happens, a podcast from the Washington Times.